Okay, we just put on the recording, so thank you for someone for raising that. Please mute your microphones at the beginning and throughout the presentations. Feel free to send questions via the chat, and then we will answer questions. If there's anything that's particularly pressing, we'll jump into the agenda. Otherwise, we will put the questions together at the end of the presentations. So let's start with the agenda. Okay, so our agenda today will provide an overview of the initiative, the objectives for phase 3, and the timeline on phase 3 of the effort. I will then turn to Nancy and Max Baumhefner to present the policy pillars of the agenda for next year, or this year and next year, and close with next steps. We will take questions at the end, as I mentioned, so please put questions in the chat in the meantime. Let's start. So I know that some of you in the audience have been with us since the beginning as signatories, and many of you have participated in our summits. But I do think that some may be new to our effort. So with that in mind, I'm going to provide an overview, or what we're calling the trajectory of the National EV Charging Initiative. And I'm going to start by setting the stage with the purpose of the initiative. From the very beginning, our goal was to provide a framework that engages all relevant stakeholders, both from the public and the private sector, and lays out how everyone involved would help deploy a national EV charging network for light, medium, heavy-duty vehicles that are going to be needed to meet the aggressive air quality, climate, job creation, and equity goals. These are our desired outcomes. They include, first of all, to realize and increase the impact and scope of President Biden's EV charging infrastructure deployment plans. We wanted to demonstrate how much progress has been made on addressing transportation electrification since 2016, and how much more is needed. Mobilize bold new commitments by non-state actors that will contribute to meeting the United States and Biden's administrative goals. Last, we aim to, and we have demonstrated, that collaboration to achieve these commitments is necessary. In phase 1, we set the stage and set up the framework for the collaboration and created something rare in the policy arena, which is goodwill. We enlisted 35 national organizations that signed an MOU. We delivered a set of EV guiding principles and hosted the National EV Charging Summit with main stage appearances of Secretary Granholm, Commerce Secretary Raimundo, and senior officials from the Departments of Transportation and Energy, with the announcement and the creation at that time, it was a new thing, the creation of the joint office. We garnered a great deal of positive attention, and as I mentioned, goodwill in the meantime. In phase 2, we followed the NEVCI funding and pivoted to the states. With the bipartisan infrastructure law in place, and at that time, the state plans had been approved in all 50 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, our work was focused on leveraging the broad representation of the initiative signatories and our advisory group to target the state's process of planning and executing NEVCI funding. We conducted outreach to the Departments of Transportation, Energy, and governor's offices of 15 states to educate officials about the work and objectives of the initiative. We hosted regional summits featuring governors from the states of Washington, Colorado, Illinois, as well as state DOTs, energy offices, and stakeholders who outlined their vision, highlighted innovative approaches and novel partnerships, and pointed out the challenges that lie ahead. In those forums, we also were happy to feature top federal officials, again, including Energy Secretary Granholm, Joint Office Executive Director Gabe Klein, who endorsed the initiative in their remarks. Now we are in the next phase of the effort that we're calling Energize. Next slide, please. So this is just a background slide that demonstrates the depth and breadth of the organization, the original sign-on signatories. You can see from this chart that we had a broad group, including OEMs, consumers, laborers, equity, folks from industry, environmental groups, utilities. We had some state actors play a role as well. The fleet, medium heavy duty fleets, regional groups as well. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to spend some time talking about the objectives of the Energize phase of our initiative. Really, the primary objective that we're looking to accomplish in this phase is really to influence the policies that are going to be needed to get steel in the ground in a timely and effective manner, and ensure that the federal money goes further. So this is going to require a more proactive engagement in the policy arena. So this is the way we're approaching it. Number one, we have already expanded the membership. We've opened membership to not only our participating organizations, but also individual companies, fleet operators, truck OEMs, and we've included the opportunity to join the organization on the website. The second thing we're doing is we're organizing a complementary policies working group. I'll discuss that later in the following slide. We're also going to be developing model legislation to advance these complementary policies. And Nancy and Max will introduce that agenda later on in the presentation. Most importantly, we want to build consensus among our stakeholders around this agenda. So we will be producing a white paper that lays out the rationale and the background for this agenda. We'll also be socializing the agenda, meeting with groups such as NARUC, NASEO, the National Governors Association, etc. And then finally, we'll create an action plan for next year to advocate for the model policies in the key states. Next slide. So this is our timeline. Many of you were with us at the fourth Roadmap Conference last week, where we launched, basically did a pre-launch of our program. Nancy, Max, we hosted a very, entertaining, I think, agenda featuring a Shark Tank approach to policy entrepreneurs addressing some of these key issues. Today, we've got our kickoff webinar, and then throughout the months of June, July, and August, we will be bringing together this working group to go through the details and discuss the background, the policies, the issues, and the approaches for the model legislation. In September, we plan to unveil the model bill, identify the target states in a summit. And then, as I mentioned, in the meanwhile, throughout all this time and in October, through October, September, October, et cetera, we'll be socializing and building support. And then in December, we'll present the advocacy game plan. Next slide. So I mentioned it before that I'm going to talk a little bit more about the complementary policy working group, because this is really the place where we need you to lend your voice and your expertise to the development of the Energize agenda. We want to really know in more detail what's important to you and to your company, determine and prioritize the issues. As I said, Max and Nancy are going to go over the 4 pillars, but we want to understand what really is important to you. We're also going to be identifying key states and venues And then we are looking to have members of this group participate and contribute into the drafting of the model legislation. And of course, anytime you're dealing with legislation and figuring out what, where and how we should execute on these, this model legislation, we need a strategy behind it. So we will be working on the strategy as well. I will be reaching out. We have had some members indicate an interest in joining the Complementary Policies Working Group. So I will be reaching out to you and others to help formulate this policy group. Next slide. And so this is the team that has been behind from the very beginning of the National EV Charging Initiative. I will be overseeing the working group. I will be basically supervising the group as a virtual executive director, working on the policy strategy and with the group and providing guidance on the state legislative strategy. Nancy will serve as the regulatory strategist to support the direction and drafting of the model legislation. She, as you many know, Nancy, she's a former commissioner at the California Public Utility Commission, very strong background in this policy arena as well. And then Max Baumhefner, who's the senior attorney at NRDC, who also has a great deal of experience, led many of these legislative efforts, will be leading the drafting of the legislation. We will be supported, as we have been from the very beginning, by social enterprises who will help us plan and execute the additional summits. Next slide. And so now I'm going to turn the microphone over to Max and Nancy too, and they will talk about our policy agenda going forward. Max.
Thank you, Colleen. And great to see a nice large virtual crowd with a lot of familiar names and some new ones as well. So, as Colleen noted, the initiative was founded partially to really complement the action that we knew was going to be coming at the federal level. And now, we're looking at historic investments coming out of the federal government through the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. But we know that that alone is not sufficient to get the job done. And we really do need model state policies to complement and stretch those federal dollars further. And there is another reason to focus at the state level, because that's where the utility industry is regulated. And the electric industry has essentially an infinite capacity to either speed up or slow down this transition. And we really need to work and have a good history of advancing policies on that front to help accelerate the electrification of the transportation sector. So we're going to be talking about 4 policy pillars today: make-ready infrastructure rules, utility programs and investments, rates designed for EV charging, and then getting it built and getting it energized. I'm going to focus on the first 2, and Nancy will take the second 2. So we can advance the slide. All right, so make-ready infrastructure rules. A picture is worth 1,000 words. This one done by NRDC's Jessica Russo. So as originally coined by Southern California Edison, the make-ready infrastructure encompassed everything you see on this picture, both on the utility side and the customer side, make-ready. And a lot of the utility programs across the United States have encompassed both sides of this little graphic here, and sometimes had rebates or other means to provide support beyond the EVSE, or the charging station as it's colloquially called. It is now the law of the land in California that the utility side make-ready will just be provided to any customer for separately metered EV charging who requests it. And that is, in a way, an extension of existing line extension allowance policy that a lot of utilities have, that have some type of cost sharing arrangement. But This provides significantly more substantial and uniform and predictable support. I think of this policy also as sort of a foundation upon which we can build this EV charging house, upon which complementary utility programs, state programs, federal programs, private investments can be built. And if that policy were in place across the United States, if we had, say, a $400 billion infrastructure investment need, this would take care of roughly a quarter or $100 billion of that. So compare that to the $7.5 billion in the federal infrastructure law, and you can see how this could really be kind of a game changer. And from folks who've worked at PUCs and who've worked on utility programs for a long time, I will note that this has the advantage of being more of a one and done solution. Once these rules are on the books, they stay there. It's not something you have to go back to the Public Utilities Commission and ask Mother May I every few years for additional budget to keep that going. So this is a kind of a fundamental policy that we'd love to see spread throughout the United States, and I think there's a lot of potential political support for doing that as well. Going on to utility programs and investments, the pie charts that you see here come from the EV Hub utility filing dashboard that Atlas Public Policy runs. And essentially in green, you see approved utility programs and investments to support EV charging infrastructure and other programs to accelerate EV adoption. And in yellow, you see pending approval, red programs that were denied. Collectively, the approved and pending approval, sum total about $7.5 billion. So again, sort of equal to what the investments coming out of Congress with the infrastructure law. The advantage of this is that you don't have to go back to Congress to keep this coming. And I noted there's a big chunk of pending utility programs across the United States, and we anticipate more and more. And a lot of those have been at the result and direction of state legislation, not always, but oftentimes. And sometimes it takes a legislative kick in the pants to enable more significant programmatic investments than might otherwise occur. There's also, we should note, a justification for utilities being proactive and investing customer dollars to accelerate transportation electrification. Synapse Energy Economics has documented that across the United States, EV drivers have already contributed $1.6 billion in net revenue. So revenue in excess of associated costs. So you put on one side of the ledger all the costs of these utility programs that you see depicted in these pie charts, plus the costs of the generation, transmission, and distribution system capacity necessary to serve EV load. And then on the other side of the ledger, you put in all the money that EV drivers have dutifully been paying on their utility bills. And the difference is $1.6 billion in net revenue, money that puts downward pressure on utility rates to the benefit of all utility customers. And we know that that number is growing. In fact, just with one additional year of real world data from California, just in that state alone, we know that the net revenue is $1.7 billion. So when Synapse updates that analysis across the whole country, you can anticipate that number being significantly larger. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to talk about one of the next policy pillars. And Nancy, I can't hear you if you're talking.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're located in the country. And thank you for joining us today. And Max, thanks for the handoff. So rates are the third of the four pillars that Max outlined for us. Rate design can make or break the case for both DC fast charging developers and fleets that are contemplating electrifying. This chart developed by Synapse Economics illustrates the consequences of the wide variety in rates, commercial and industrial rates across the country that apply to DC fast charging, typically apply to DC fast charging in fleets. And what you can see is that at low load factor, so in the early years of operation for a DC fast charging station, 5 or 10% load factor, the cost per kilowatt hour can work out to be as high as more than 75 cents. And in some places, which leads to a situation where we don't see savings for customers from electrifying, and also makes for a very difficult business case for prospective DC fast charging developers. You can also see that as you look across utilities across the country, there's wide variation. This, again, is a consequence of not so much the level of rates, but as the structure of rates, the amount of the costs, the utilities costs that are recovered through the demand charge versus the energy charge, the demand charge reflecting the customer's highest demand during a billing period, highest usually 15-minute or hour interval during a billing period. And Congress recognized that this is a challenge. In the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Congress included some amendments to PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory and Policy Act, which effectively recommend or direct state energy regulators to consider adopting EV charging rates. As I think most of you are aware, there's complex federalism governs the electricity industry in this country, and most major decisions are outside of the transmission system and regional transmission operators. Most things are the purview of state regulators. So Congress couldn't direct the states to adopt EV rates to encourage electrification, but could direct them to consider it. And a number of states, though far from all states, have opened up dockets to act on this directive. The second dimension of rates, of course, is residential rates, which translate into the costs for individual drivers who purchase EVs. Since most charging occurs at home, particularly obviously for people who live in single-family homes and are able to plug in at home. And with residential rates, there are some critical issues that are somewhat different than for commercial and industrial rates. The real challenge for residential rates is to take advantage of the significant flexibility in the timing of charging and to send customers price signals that encourage them to charge in a manner that's beneficial to the grid. So that might be encouraging them to charge off-peak so that we can spread the cost of fixed assets across more kilowatt hours and lower the average cost of service, which is the one way to put downward pressure on rates. Alternatively, rates could be structured in a way in areas that have a high penetration of solar energy. Rates could be structured in a way so as to encourage customers to charge during periods of peak solar production so that we increase the uptake of solar energy, don't curtail solar power plants, and then correspondingly discourage customers from charging during periods when solar is tapering off and it's more likely that fossil-fired plants might run. So rate design plays a critical role in how residential charging relates both to the transmission and distribution grid and the operation of generation on the grid. And getting these right is an important part of making electrification, transportation electrification, beneficial electrification. As part of this initiative last year, I co-authored a paper with Max's former colleague at NRDC, Miles Muller, and two other co-authors on best practices for commercially EV rates. And again, this was intended to be a resource to support commissions as they act on the PURPA amendments and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and consider adopting EV rates to encourage electrification. And the focus of this paper was commercial and industrial rates, and it was published by the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, which is the National Association for all of the state energy regulators. So this is an important part of the collateral for this campaign, and I expect to be working on a corresponding document addressing best practices on the for residential rates. So the fourth pillar, getting it built and energized. This is the topic du jour, which if you go to any of the conferences on electrification this year, you will hear about, you will hear horror stories about long waits for fleets or DC fast charging developers to get their stations interconnected, connected to the grid and energized. And we are really just at the beginning of what could be, you know, a tsunami of interconnection requests. And it's evident already that existing planning and interconnection processes are not up to the job, and utilities and their regulators are going to need new tools and potentially new authority to move forward. So let me walk through how we envision developing this agenda and the rationale for it. So the chart shown in this slide is from a report released earlier this month by the International Council on Clean Transportation, the ICCT. And what they looked at is the impact of electrification of freight or goods movement on the grid. And they wanted to understand where the impacts in 2030, where the impacts would be greatest. And they considered two factors in projecting energy demand for charging electrified trucking. One was states that have or will adopt the advanced clean trucking rule developed in California, Advanced Clean Trucks, ACT. So the ACT states, of which I think there are now 7, and others are considering adopting ACT. And then they also considered states where the combination of relatively low electricity rates and high density of intermodal hubs, ports, et cetera, point to a high level of electrification. And what you can see is that, you know, it's the initial impacts in this, you know, still relatively early stage of electrifying goods movement. Impacts are really pretty heavily concentrated in a handful of states, and within those states in a handful of counties. So that's the good news. That's, you know, we know at a macro level where the, you know, which states and which regulators and which utilities need to really go on high alert to be prepared to meet this load. But eventually, you know, load from corridor charging will show up almost everywhere. There's both positives and negatives in this picture. The exciting thing is in the bottom left-hand corner are brand new eCascadia trucks manufactured at the Daimler plant in Oregon, ready to go to California. The bad news is that they're waiting to go to California because the depot that will house them doesn't have electric service yet. And they're emblematic of the delays that we're already starting to see in interconnection, and really graphically illustrate the need to refresh the paradigm for interconnection. To give a sense of the magnitude of the challenge, you see on the right-hand side, my colleague Max Baumhefner holding a 1 megawatt connector. So that's, the box is actually smaller than it would be in reality, but the connector is what would actually plug into a truck like one of these East Cascadia trucks to charge it up at a rate of 1 megawatt. So that's 3 times the fastest DC fast charger that is out there for light duty vehicles. So imagine a charging depot like the one at the top photo, only 10 or 50 times bigger, with 50 of those 1 megawatt chargers, following the megawatt standard, which is about to be finalized. And that's the magnitude of the loads at individual locations that will show up in some of those counties that were shaded dark in the map that I just showed you. So this is an unprecedented challenge for the electricity industry and for their regulators and for local permitting authorities, who will naturally be pulled in as new substations, subtransmission, and in some cases transmission lines need to be developed. So the Energize agenda is that we will be working on developing with the Complementary Policies Working Group. That's where we're going to come up with a suite of policies to address this problem. And some of these policies are linked with the policy pillars that we've already discussed. So I'm not going to go through this matrix in detail, but this gives you a sense of the dimensionality of the challenge here, that part of the issue is data to inform the planning process. Utilities don't know exactly where and when charging load will appear. They may know that a whole, the acres and acres of warehouses you see when you fly into Ontario and Southern California, eventually all of those will be electrified, but which ones will go first, they don't know. On the flip side, developers who want to build DC fast charging stations and want to move quickly, they don't know where there is surplus capacity on the grid where they can slot in today. But that can be addressed with utilities publishing hosting capacity maps, which some of them do today. On the utility uncertainty side, EPRI has launched an initiative to have major shippers and fleet operators and truck OEMs provide information that can help utilities pinpoint where load will occur. And there have also been some efforts in California to put more data into planners' hands. So measures like that are potential tools that we could add into the Energize agenda. So this is basically the framework in which we intend to take a systematic approach to identify the full set of problems and look at what solutions to them could be generically, and then identify specific measures that would go into model legislation and/or model regulations or tariffs. And we will try not to invent the wheel where we don't have to, and draw on good practices that already exist. For example, Max talked about the make-ready tariff in California that was directed, the utilities were directed to adopt those tariffs under Assembly Bill 841, which passed a few years ago, and then implemented them in Rules 29 and 45. So those provide templates that we can work off of. Similarly, in New York State, there's a bill pending in the legislature that would give the New York utilities, direct them to plan ahead for corridor charging to serve light, medium, and heavy duty electrified transportation, and then give them some degree of authorization to build ahead of load. That's the conventional paradigm is really kind of a just-in-time approach to meeting the challenges, or to meeting interconnection requests. Couple of other key areas are the fact that the process that is just quite slow, and there are potential process reforms to both for the utility process for interconnection. Things like it can be streamlined, queue reform, clustering. There are a lot of good examples that we can take out of the playbook for integration of renewable resources, and more recently distributed energy resources like storage and small scale solar projects. So there's definitely some reforms that we can repurpose to address transportation electrification, and permitting is another area where we can both get ahead of the game, again, with better data and a longer term planning horizon, and more planning tools, anticipate where new substations may be needed or new lines may be needed, start that permitting process sooner, do it in a with a clustered approach, and potentially with reform of the and or exemptions to the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, or in California, the California Environmental Quality Act. So there are a number of plays that potentially could make their way into the model legislation. And then finally, another couple of other issues that have emerged and are, again, very much on the, come out in the conferences and articles. You see it in Utility Dive all the time, is the nationwide transformer shortage. Often that is cited, waiting 12 or 18 months to get a big transformer is cited as the reason why a particular site can't be interconnected. So that's going to take a concerted effort to stockpile transformers, to potentially onshore some of the manufacturing for transformers. Those are long-term plays. Meanwhile, to address in the short term, this shortage, again, that really points to making sure that developers know where the points are on the grid today, where there's spare capacity, so that we take full advantage of the slack that we have today, using rates that encourage all customers to shift load off peak when they can, to reduce transformer loadings. And again, that's especially the case on the residential grid. And factoring the transformer shortage into near-term planning. And then finally, the other resource limitation that's widely cited is people. Simply the lack of people to just do the just the massive workload associated with all of these interconnection requests, which will only snowball over time. So again, there is some time to plan ahead and do some workforce development, but we're already playing catch up. Making sure that utilities are able to hire enough people and recover the cost of that is, the purview of rate cases at state regulatory commissions. It's also a well-known fact that the standard cost of service or rate of return regulation model for electric utilities really is more focused, or creates an incentive to bulk up on CapEx, and while OpEx is really just a pass through, so the utility doesn't earn a return on it. So some states are beginning to experiment with what's called performance-based regulation, which provides additional incentives to kind of do things that the standard model doesn't support. So to meet staffing targets, or I think more realistically and more appropriately, to actually hit targets for the overall length of time from interconnection request to energization. So as you can see, there's a pretty broad landscape of challenges, and I think we have a pretty good sense, pretty good playbook of generic solutions, which now need to be translated into model legislation, model regulation, model tariffs. And that will be the work of the Complementary Policies Working Group, along with the 3 other pillars we discussed. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Colleen, and I think we're ready to talk about next steps and then go to Q&A.
Right. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Max. That was very comprehensive and very helpful. So immediate next steps, as I mentioned, will be organizing the Complementary Policies Working Group. This will, this is the folks that are going to roll up their sleeves, work through these issues, develop the model legislation. We'll do that through a series of webinars that we'll host on, basically take it by the topics. And then, as Nancy mentioned, we'll be developing the collateral material. We'll put together basically a library, so to speak, of what we know is out there, some of the examples that ICCT report, the Synapse, et cetera, some of the materials that we know are out there already. And then we'll be developing a new white paper on energizing and getting it built. And then, as I mentioned on the timeline, from there, we'll be really meeting with other organizations to socialize the agenda, do what I'm calling sort of a reveal in September with a summit, planning to really kind of make that summit something like almost like a hearing. Hopefully we can potentially get some of the authors of the bills that have already, I just got a note from Ryan about what's happening in New York. We'd like to bring those, some of those actors into this discussion and not only, help share with us their experience and also develop our own legislative strategy going forward. So thanks everyone for your attention. We do have a number of questions. Nancy and Max, most of them are, I think, relevant to you guys. If you guys want to take a look, or I could, let's see.
Do you want to just kind of call out the questions to us, Colleen?
Sure. This is from Linda Hutchins Knowles, and she points out that it's important for residents of apartments and condos to have access. There's Linda right there. Do you want to just speak to it, Linda?
Yeah, basically I put it in the chat, but so many newly built apartments and condos are being built, and it's just basically a huge lost opportunity if those parking places are built without the EV charging pre-wired and without it being directly wired. So the EV Charging for All Coalition's been working on model code, focusing on California, but expanding beyond. And we'd love to be in conversation with you as you develop these model codes, because we think, or model legislation, because we think we have to stop building retrofits. There's a lot of work to those retrofits. That's the hardest thing to crack, but it should be much easier upfront. And statewide building codes can be very much like the cold water flat analogy that I learned from Andrea Malpiero Colomina of Green Latinos. But up until the 1960s in this country, apartments often in low-income communities were built with no hot water, no pipes for hot water, because it was more expensive. And it wasn't until the building codes required that all apartments and condos, no matter what income level, had hot water piping, that became a universal accessible thing. And so likewise, we think EV charging at home should be universally accessible. So the newly built apartments and condos should be pre-wired directly to the unit's panel or meter, so they can get those time of use rates from their utility. So is that of interest to this team? Would that kind of work on building codes be a part of your initiative, do you envision?
It's definitely something that NRDC has supported in the past, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I think we're following up to figure out how it could, since there's a difference between building codes and state law, but you can have state laws that tell agencies to do things, which could be a way to kick in the pants to advance things like what you're describing, which make a hell of a lot of sense.
Yeah, Linda, I want to thank you for raising that question, because I think it also raises a broader principle, which is just, it may seem expensive to wire the apartment in advance or wire an apartment building in advance, just as it may seem expensive to supersize a substation or the conduit that goes out to a charging plaza. But it's often a false economy, right? Because if you have to go back and jackhammer up the concrete or, rewire the building, that's expensive too. So it's kind of a pay me now or pay me, or pay me more later proposition. And I think that's very much the spirit of a lot of components of the Energize agenda.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, it costs about 10 times more to do it later. So that's really, not smart. So yeah, I'll reach out to you offline and let's connect. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. Now I'd like to open the floor if he's still on, to Dean Taylor. Dean's a pioneer, certainly in the industry. And Dean, you made a couple of comments if you're still on, and you want to join either talk to them or I can read them out.
The first comment I met, there was a CEC interconnection to the distribution system workshop recently, and I think I didn't attend, so I'm hearing the secondhand that planners were making the point that we should be better about using the words energize and interconnect. So maybe some others on the call know this better than me, but they're basically saying energize is for loads, and anything connected to the grid like storage or renewables or V2G is interconnect. So
Okay.
they're kind of asking us to get better in using those words. So I open that up. Maybe others want to chime in.
Well, I think that there are challenges with both, Dean, and we need to be more precise about associating the challenges and the solutions with interconnection versus energization. But that's a point well taken.
And then the other comment I made in the chat was about substations and feeders. I heard you briefly mention that just now, but that was one of the main purposes. I worked with Miles on that bill 2700 to basically be able to, goes beyond what AB 841 did to basically get substations and feeders built well in advance.
Yeah, and we didn't mention it, but there's a bill moving in California. And right now, there was actually 10 bills related to interconnection and energization by my informal inventory. Most of them have died at this point, but SB 410 by Senator Becker, which deals with energizing not just for EV charging, but also for building decarbonization, is moving along, and it complements AB 2700, which Jean mentioned, especially for and for those who are unaware, AB 2700 did basically two things. One was require the Air Resources Board and the Energy Commission and the Department of Motor Vehicles to provide their data on where cars, trucks, and buses are electrifying to the PUC and the utilities to inform system planning. And then there's a second piece that required the utilities to basically plan and propose grid upgrades and investments in their general rate cases that are commensurate with meeting the state's very aggressive transportation electrification requirements. SB 410 complements that second piece in particular by allowing for the utilities who kind of missed that boat, like San Diego Gas and Electric and Pacific Gas and Electric, whose general rate cases were filed before AB 2700 went into effect, to propose similar investments and then recover the costs via a balancing account. Southern California Edison has proposed investments in its current general rate case, just filed 2 weeks ago or so, but even they could probably benefit from that balancing account in the future, because you can't know which substation you're going to miss a couple of years from now. And at that point, we still don't want to have to wait another, 3 or 4 years for the next general rate case in order to get going on those things. Because as some of the comments in the chat point out, it takes a long time and we need a lot of them. It's just basically what the ICCT analysis points out. So we have to start now.
I would just add that yesterday, the California agencies led by the PUC did a workshop, they call it the freight infrastructure planning, and it's about like substations and things like that, even transmission line planning, to do it in advance, because it's a big deal to find, in some cases, to find and buy the land and just do all that for loads that are coming, in some cases 10, 15 years from now, to get ahead of the curve is the basic idea.
Yeah, great, thanks. I have a question here from Peter Olmsted of FreeWire. Peter, if you're on, you'd like to address your question? I think it's a good one, if you're still on.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Colleen. And appreciate the presentation, which covers a lot of ground. So Thanks for going through that. Yeah, my observation was just that, and Nancy touched on it a little bit with respect to rates and hosting capacity maps, but there's an increasing discussion, in the policy realm around the need for managing all this load. And we're seeing it show up in some of the more common policy conversations, both with respect to rate design and even make ready programs. So seems like you have a great platform here that could also touch into strategies that will be increasingly important to think about how site hosts are able to build to accommodate the load they'll need for electrification, but also to manage that load. So thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
Peter, thank you for that. Oh, if I can
Go ahead,
respond.
Nick.
Yeah, Peter, thank you for that comment. I mean, I think one thing about getting rate design right is to really have those rates accurately reflect the utility's costs in a way that we strike the right balance between charging behavior, and the technology that's, and the upgrade to the site, and the power that goes to the site, the size of the interconnection, versus the technology that can be on the site, whether it's storage, integrated storage, or distributed generation. So we really strike the right balance and don't build more distribution capacity out to the site than is economical. So I think we got to really get that balance right in rate design, and that's part of the message that we tried to get across in our paper last year.
Thanks, Nancy. I'm going to now call on Aravind with Volvo Truck. He's expressed some issues in the chat, and I'd like to give him the floor to share that with us.
Oh, hey, thank you. Good to be on this call. I just wanted to flag that the PUC freight integration planning workshop, the scope that was presented was more the 3 to 20 year time frame, and it really did not address the imminent issues that all of us are talking about. We obviously have a role to just, again, iron out the interconnection energization definitions, but really the focus there seems to be, okay, how are we going to get the planning and the interagency, intra-agency processes ironed out so that we are going to be ready over the next 10 to 15 years. They said 3 to 20 years, but really it's further out. And that is needed, but I think for ensuring success of ACT and ACF, which start tomorrow, I think we have our work cut out. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was the conclusion of a lot of folks who participated in the PUC workshop, which I think it's good to know that the PUC is aware of these issues and is doing stuff to address the challenge, but I think it underscores the need for legislation to change the rules of the game and help address the short-term and the long-term issues, because we need to do both. And for those who, there's a lot of conversation about California here, as often happens with EVs, but like, as Nancy has noted, when you're a Californian going to other states, it's often good to be humble and say, learn from our mistakes. And what we're facing right now is a real problem. And we have these trucks like the ones that were shown on Nancy's slides. Volvo has plenty they can show too. And I know Tesla and EVgo and others have been complaining about the stations they have in the ground that they can't use because they can't get power. And, it's a real problem. So I think what we're hoping to do with the initiative is to try to get ahead of this challenge in other states where it hasn't, bitten as hard yet. But we know it, it's a movie that will be coming to you if it hasn't already. And I don't know how to finish that analogy. Good popcorn or something. But anyways, we want to help get ahead of the game.
Yes, I'm a big movie watcher. We want a happy ending, Max.
Yeah. Well, here's my movie analogy. Like, you can still watch on Netflix the Who Killed the Electric Car, right? And then starting 10 years ago, the sequel came out of The Revenge of the Electric Car. And we want to ensure that there's not a third movie, Empire Strikes Back, so to speak, and it's Who Killed the Electric Car and Truck. So
Yes.
that's what we're trying to prevent.
Good point. Hey, Scott Wilson, if you're still on from Maryland, had comments about rate design.
Yeah. Hi. The yeah, the for multifamily housing, there's a condo complex that put in 6 NLX level 2 chargers. So the idea is, let's give condo owners, residents, the same at-home charging experience that single family houses have. And so they put in 6, and then they got classified as commercial. So now they have to pay demand charges. So if they exceed a certain amount of of the 15-minute interval, then they're getting hit with demand charges. So what they've done is they've dialed down the power on all the chargers. So now it's throttled. So it's not giving the residents a very good experience. And yet, so this is just a condo complex. Across the street are single family homes, and of course they're residential, so they're not paying demand charges. And the thing is, it's kind of a perverse incentive, because so let's say that several cars want to charge at the condo, then since it's dialed down, they're going to go to DC fast chargers. So then it's like, so now it's kind of like pushing people to DC fast charging, which then they're paying demand charges for, in the background. And so it's kind of encouraging the wrong thing. So there's 2 ideas that we've come up with. Either you wait until the utilization passes a certain threshold, and then you kick in demand charges, or you just classify them as residential. It's residential, it's single family homes, they're just stacked on top of each other. So that's something that we need to watch out for, and that's going to reveal itself as multifamily housing gets more and more banks of chargers. If you put in a couple at a time, it's not really going to show up. But when you put in a half dozen, then it shows up. And so that's
Scott, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that example. I mean, I think, again, this is it illustrates the consequences of not taking a holistic view about this wholesale transformation. And while the adoption is incremental and the installation of charging in some places may be incremental, it's a wholesale change, and we need something that we need solutions that work in the long run and provide incentives for the behavior that's the most cost effective for everyone, and disseminating best practices, as we're trying to do in this initiative, and working through organizations like NEVCI to get the word out to commissions and commission staff, and also the role of DOE and Edison Electric Institute and educating utilities about best practices. I think all of those are channels to call attention to these kinds of problems that can arise, and treat them as the canary in the coal mine and cautionary tales that we don't want to see repeated.
Yeah, and if I might add, I think there's been a lot of utilities, especially on the East Coast, who have been loath to admit that their existing commercial rates are anything but economic efficiency at its zenith. And so if they're forced to, they'll put a discount or a temporary demand charge waiver on those rates. But then we've seen that already. We've seen those expire in some places, and then you're back right where you started. Whereas the rate designs that are in the paper that Nancy authored, as noted with my former colleague, Miles Muller, who is now at Rivian, along with CalSTART and the National Consumer Law Center, point to more long-term solutions that do not require temporary subsidies or discounts, but reflect those underlying costs, don't involve cross subsidies from other customers, and are more permanent solutions that just take into account the unique nature of this load to solve that challenge for a variety of applications.
Thanks, Max. I wanted to see if Ryan Galantine, with Advanced Energy Union, who shared with us an update on the New York bill. If you just, could you provide the whole group the update, Ryan? And also you're a fellow practitioner of the legislative and lobbying world. Because I do think
Yes.
what you pointed to are going to be the challenges of running any legislation. You start with the
Yeah.
model, and then you end up with sausage that you never thought you'd ever have to eat. But there you go. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in. Ryan Galantine with Advanced Energy United. So the deal with the New York bill, which is one we've been working on, and Nancy mentioned, that bill originally was crafted to have utilities get together with the various state agencies there in the PSC to identify locations of high priority for distribution system upgrades, including ports, NEVCI stations, freight distribution centers in the state, especially downstate in New York, and then deploy a capital plan in advance of those things. Unfortunately, and we're still kind of trying to figure out exactly what happened, but the bill was amended to only do the first part and not the second part, which I think is interesting, but doesn't really do much. We don't necessarily need, we need to do the study. In fact, we'll still support the bill likely. But the interesting thing is actually that reform of how the process is working. So I think with a lot of these things, it's easier to have kind of a first mover. You could argue there's some process in place in California that you could do it through various regulatory venues that we've talked about. But, I think we'll have to go back through this process and identify how we can continue to educate legislators that the cost of, doing this later and putting it off is greater, much greater, actually, in my opinion, than allowing it to happen sooner. So I think we'll probably have to go back to the drawing board in New York in next session to try to get this done, unfortunately. But I think there's an opportunity here to templatize that concept and maybe some things, from California 26 to tackle this.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Actually, Pam just weighed in from EDF. She was, I guess, on the ground, maybe in Albany, working that bill. Again, I think all of this input and all of this experience is going to be important as part of our strategy for what we bring forward and where and how next year. Pam, if you're still on, do you want to just share your thoughts?
Hi, Colleen. Thanks. I wasn't there. We had two of my colleagues actually lobbying with legislators yesterday there. There was two main reasons that we saw the bill kind of fall apart. The first one is the overwhelming concern that this is going to cost way too much and have a negative impact on ratepayers. And even with our Synapse study, which focused primarily on distribution grid and make-ready upgrades, that was insufficient to convince them for proactive build and a capital plan for that. So it's clear we need to have a bit more analysis to support that. The other side was there was a complementary bill being put forward by Cummings that looked at New York statewide, not just highway charging, which they had been pitched by National Grid that this is a highway charging study, even though it's looking at broader than highways, also depot charging and public charging hubs. that looks at DC fast charging broadly needs for charging, a study. And so we actually don't think that even the condensed version of this bill will pass, but that the Cummings one will instead, because they feel it's more broad covering. And so that's also a lack of alignment and early communication and engagement with legislators. That is a lesson learned there for us. Yes, the Comrie bill, thanks, Brian. That we were a little bit taken aback by, but I do think it was a good lessons learned for something that we can move forward in other states and in the next session as well.
Yeah, Pamela, thanks for the update and for you, Ryan. I think what you're encountering there is the perception that we're building the field of dreams and that it could be stranded assets and cost a lot. And I think we do need to sharpen our pencils to have real world examples of how it's cheaper to do it once and do it right. And actually, after the meeting you organized in Anaheim, I asked Charlie Alcock to start putting together some numbers on that for us. So we should reconvene to do that. I can report that things are going a little bit better in California with SB 410. It's expected to go to the floor today and pass out of the Senate with strong support, no registered opposition at this point, and a growing coalition of labor, industry, environmental justice groups. So that could be a good model too, especially with the coalition that I think we're building and support that can overcome some of those perceptions. But I think the messaging also matters too. This isn't about building in advance, it's about no longer building too late.
Hey, great. Thanks, everyone. Really helpful to get these real world on the spot updates too. Just, demonstrates how relevant this discussion is and how important going forward it is as well. So I don't have any more questions really. If anyone feels like they, have a pressing need to either just raise your hand, or if not, we'll give you all back some of your time today. And thank you so much for your attention and for your interest. This is really an important topic.
That with other people as well.
Yeah, this reminded me, we haven't referenced this a lot.
Okay, so we had some back there.
I have a question that I put in the chat. It's Stephen Sondheim. May I ask
Okay.
it? I'm not sure it was addressed.
Sure. Go ahead, Stephen.
I believe in EVs, my God. I'm a transportation expert, and I think that's really the way to go. But I'm very worried because a number of good environmental people are raising the notion that it's going to overwhelm our electrical capacity tremendously. And my concern is that it's going to call into play more fossil and more nuclear and justify that. I personally believe that that's not necessarily so, but I think we really need to figure out the capacity that we will have and whether it meets the need. I'm very concerned about that. And I'm not sure anybody's really done a study of that. If we did that study and we figured out what we needed, we could gear up to it. But the other side, if you know what I mean, is really using that. Any comments? Thank you.
Yeah, Stephen, it's a good question. I think we should be more careful in how we're describing the challenge, because I think the ICCT paper that Nancy showed, for example, really shows that the challenge is at the distribution system level for transformers and substations and such. That same study shows that at the generation level that you're talking about for the power plants and solar farms and such, it's not such a big of a challenge. It's a relatively modest increase in total electricity production required. And that study is consistent with lots of studies that have projected this. I think back to a 2007 Pacific Northwest National Labs study that estimated that we could electrify something like 80% of the passenger cars and trucks in the United States without building a single new power plant, just taking advantage of the capacity that was already on the grid. That is largely true today. I've asked the authors if they could renew that analysis. And they told me they're busy doing other stuff, but the results would basically be the same if they were to do it again. And I think a lot of other studies have come to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
Well, I
I'll
hope so.
add- Yeah, Stephen, thank you for, thank you for
Sure.
raising this
The other
question.
thing I want to say, just real quickly, is people are looking at the fast chargers from Tesla, and they're stating that it's a huge amount compared to the capacity we have now. And they're projecting out that we will not be able to do it and we're going to have to go back to fossil and nuclear. So I
Well-
just caution us to really get that future analysis done.
This is precisely the mission of this initiative, Stephen, is to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I will also add that before I joined eMobility Advisors, I was for several years a partner at Energy and Environmental Economics, E3, which has done study after study for state after state, mostly states that are the ACT states, Advanced Clean Truck states, and looked at their overall low carbon transition, which transportation electrification is only one piece. And you have to look at it in the broader context of also the decarbonization of their generation, which is, these are all states with, carbon caps. I mean, at least the first moving states are all states with, aggressive greenhouse gas mitigation caps, targets, and aggressive renewable programs, and a recognition that the transformation of these two sectors has to work together. And even in places like Florida and Texas, which are of course not ACT states and don't have RPSs, they have they're both states with very favorable economics for renewable energy. And I think Texas is by far the #1 wind state. Florida is home to one of the biggest solar developers in the world. So I think but we have to, that message is out there all the time, and we have to be vigilant about counteracting it. So thank you. Colin, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. I want to, I just saw that Noel Cristosimo had some additional references based on some of the Biden administration initiatives. Noel, if you're still on, why don't you jump in and share that with us?
Hi, this is Noel from DOE's Office of Policy. Just some recent research coming out of the Department of Energy and NREL showing that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act will have the potential of increasing the clean electricity share in the United States to 80% by 2030, which is up from a business as usual or no policy case of around 50% by that time. So EVs are clean today and will become cleaner over time.
That is great. All those contributions from that legislation and the Biden administration, that's another important part of our messaging here. Because it's not business as usual. I think, let's see. Oh, there's a couple of questions about links that people have asked Max about your link, some of the links of the studies that you've cited. So we'll provide those in the chat. And the recording, I think, will be available. It will be on our website. And outside of that, I'll just thank everyone for their participation. And we will be bringing our complementary policies working group, the folks that really are going to be available to really roll up their sleeves and help us with this journey. So thanks very much and have a great rest of the day and a wonderful Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.